All right. Admin stuff before we get to the interesting bit, and that is feeding you information so we can ask you more in the exam. So, first of all, kudos to everyone who committed early and did all this what we asked to. And then there was this sudden surprise of me scrolling down the list and realizing, oops, there's quite a number of people I hadn't considered yet, because I was under the impression that I had managed at the first shot to fill all slots and assign all topics. Anyway, so we have another few selections, which is actually good because there are some gaps that have been filled subsequently. Only problem I have now is we have slightly too many lectures. So one option is to extend the semester. Bruno, what do you think? Shall we write to Edie? Tough one? Doesn't work? Okay. Right, or we can, we can actually have a lecture after the exam. How's that? That would be perfect. Who's keen to filling that slot? Anyway, so we're in a bit tough one though. So as you have noted, so next week we have a very important topic which we can't forget about. So Rune is going to talk about pedagogy a bit, or learning more generally, right? So I think that's the plan. Still good. Good. So we leave that slot for Rune, and then it's your turn, right? So who's getting nervous? Okay, no one. Okay, well, slightly sad, but sure. So some of you, or most of you in fact, define their slots already as quite important. But when we look at it carefully, you figure out, hang on, it's only 10 of them. So that's good. But we probably have slight issues with the allocation. So I'm just going through it, the names and the associated topics, just to be clear about who is doing what. And in some cases, I'll recommend some additional member to join the team. So in worst case, you need to work with 3 people. How awful is that, huh? 3 people, unbelievable. So that's massive group size we're dealing with here. So we have propaganda games, that's unchanged, right? Mm-hmm. Is the corresponding community there? That's good. Lucky me. Decision making. Yep. It's you, that's right. And Vega, Tom Vega? Possibly? Okay. If any of you, by the way, let's go back to that later. Then we have awareness. You two, I think you get a new group member, at least that's my suggestion. Let's see if this group member is here as well. And if I scroll down, that could, no, it's Johanna already, anyway. But now, we have not everyone is here, I believe. That's right. So you have a group of 3 people, right? Awareness, cool, settled. Decision making, game analysis, Blue's not here. Right now the group is complete. Hakun, Ness?
He left.
He left what?
He left. Will not attend.
Sorry, from the course or just for now?
This class.
Only for this setting, right?
Okay.
I'm planning long term, so
Long term,
let me know if you. If anyone who doesn't plan to come back, let me know. Just so I can adjust the plan accordingly. Okay, that's sorted. Tomasz, I know it's not here today, but psychological effects. Kai Hannemann, where is he? There you go. Still sticking to it?
Yeah.
Good. Morten, Nikolai, and Clara. That's right. All of them you there. So lucky you have the group is already working out. So health and wellness is your topic. Then we had Andre. I don't see him here right now. He wanted to talk about technology. So while technology is an important topic, there would be a compromise. But since we're running a bit out of lecture space, I was thinking about coercing him into analysis, because there's a bit of an underrepresentation there, because there's quite a bit of work on game analysis, and you can of course bring in technological aspects as well. But I hope somehow to get in touch with him. Hopefully watch the stream or in via Discord or like. News games, we sorted this. Right, so Vega is doing news games. And where are you situated right now?
I'm down, Vilda.
Vilda, there you go.
Yeah.
You can get your first choice, cool.
Yeah.
Lucky.
I just changed it.
So now I need to figure out how I change what color is still not occupied. Because I'm not only running out of lecture slots, I'm already running out of colors as well. So let's try a light blue. So let's just sorry, it takes a bit of I need to maintain sanity, otherwise I'm completely lost here. because it's not as easy as I thought. So, I think that's the one. Good, sorted. So Andre is still. So about Vega, news games. Yep. Yeah, cool. In for it, right? Sorted. Training. Kalile Rinde. She's not here, I believe. That's fine. And there's someone here who is here actually. And there's Björna. Cool. Training. Works for you. Good. Sounds good. Health and wellness sorted. Psych sorted. Education. Yes, cool. Still in for it. Good. Did someone change something here, possibly, hypothetically? I don't know. Because I had a bit of a balance. Doing education alone is a bit of a tough one, because that's probably, as far as literature is concerned, the heaviest theme. So now we have a lot of people on science education. Andre, would you be interested in talking about education instead of technology, or is that out of? Yeah.
If there are a problem?
We're running out of slots. So I'm seeing how to snack you in. You have one of the important topics, but your topic can be embedded in many others because tech. But we can talk about it in a break. In any case, welcome. So, science education, we are more than well represented. You guys and Ru Yang. You? Yeah. So joining them, cool. Science education, that's a good one. Of course, strong overlap with education. I mean, yeah. I mean, you can bring in aspects. Basically the overlap is considerable. So you need to be very careful about what education covers and what you cover. So sometimes a bit challenging. Okay, awareness, news games sorted, and there's a new idea about student performance. That's interesting. Alexander Nissen, Ole Joachim Arsen, I believe. That's a new topic. They suggested this. Sure, go for it. My problem is how to figure out the 11 slots. So, few options. Option number one, we proactively combine themes. So instead of having a extended discussion on a given paper for one or two of those subjects, we combine those different sessions. Second, which I don't really like because it has a bit of a bias, can be unfair to some extent. But that said, you, for example, could integrate education, science education. That could be an angle to take. Version number 2, we have an additional session we can do. And that's roughly options I know. So I think we're now at 11 lectures, so one too many. So that's a bit of a challenge. In the break, we probably can first of all figure out where we situate everyone, and then we do a kind of call on how we solve this kind of little conundrum of if we can group certain topics so they can possibly be discussed adjunct to each other. Would extending beyond the official lecture schedule be a problem for you guys? No? Okay, then we could possibly do it in the one, we patch on an additional week of presentations and sort it out then. That's probably a most sensible outcome, the way I see it. Because then we have a reasonably fair arrangement here. Unless you guys feel like, oh no, we want to merge our topics. Which may or may not be clever. Good. All right. So sorted. That one sorted. Please be aware about your changed group arrangements. And please accommodate the naming here as well. So if you have a new group member, please nudge that person to add themselves or add yourself if you are the new group member and so on. And ensure that everything is still aligned. Then we can think about we will think about another date for session here, for session 11 after that, basically. So there's basically 2 remaining slots that can be thought about.
I think education can go to the science education.
Yeah. So you want to merge that? Is that the idea?
Yeah, of course, it's education.
Okay, let's do it in the break, right? All the education, science education people, let's just briefly chat so we can weed out the interfaces. Because the risk is there that you have overlap, right? So we need to just be clear about it. Cool, let's do it in the break and then decide on this after that. Sounds good? Cool. Another aspect, topic areas. So now since you have all picked your topics, I can let go and let all my biases flow. So introduce a bit of topical literature just to get some people started to some extent. there's some additional pointers with respect to certain areas, right? So, and the resources that are listed are reasonably diverse. Some of them are really more or less an ad hoc find it. That looks good. Let's see what they do, make of it, or if it's useful or not. Others are actually serious scientific papers. I made reference to books when necessary, popular science reports, but sometimes even simple things such as reference to a game or blog posts or just list of games, which can be sometimes really good for you to kind of come up with a set of examples, because that's, I think, what you want to concentrate on to illustrate whatever you want to have to say about training, science education, and so on, using examples where possible. So there is a heavy bias, just to prepare you, a heavy bias on education and training in this representation, as you will notice when skimming over it. And the reason is simply that the most literature is in this area, naturally, because it's all about learning. I mean, next week it will become clearer. But this doesn't mean that you guys have a head start and have easier life. Quite the opposite. In fact, you would need to feel pushed a bit more to go beyond the obvious, because the groups that are talking before you will most likely implicitly talk about education anyway and learning, right? So you need to think about this. You can't just necessarily stick to what we already know or what you are already taught by us in one way or another. So have a skim through the corresponding sections. Some are a bit scarce, some are more extended. Again, science education falls, of course, also under education. And some of those links are really cross-cutting, right? If the list of games, of course, they're not only falling in one category. In many respects, they apply to others as well. So use those resources to your benefit. Anyway, that's just some minor pointers. I'm not neither requiring you or not even expecting you to work based on those ones, but just to get you started about that field. Because there's nothing like a directory of the different areas, disciplines of serious games, right? So it's a really fuzzy area, as we saw those Venn diagrams and so on. It's really undefined. So sometimes it's really tough to find a good starting point. That's why those nudges. What is more reliable in terms of sources? We think about quality and the scientific perspective. There we go. Good part is GitLab is so slow, it's actually slowing me down. That's always helpful. So there's some lists to sources, right? So journals, for example, and they're really diverse. I mentioned those last time already. I just want to reinforce it as people forget to look at this as well. That's not generally not specific papers and so on, but really more the resources. Use those journals, browse their archives, use their search engines and so on. And sometimes it's not too obvious. For example, the Journal of Computer Game Culture. But it also has something about serious games at times. Computer game research, of course, and so on. So again, there's not a single journal that combines, or field of journals that combines, integrates serious games. Probably the ones closest to it is the International Journal of Serious Games itself. And then there's various books, some of them with a certain twist towards areas, of course, for example, physical rehabilitation, if that's of interest. Simulations with respect to content, but also more. Introduction to game analysis, hint, because that's not an easy one. But anyway, so it's quite a bit of things there already. Feel free if you find new journals or other resources. If they're topically related, ideally, of course, they are. But if they're of general value, you think we all can benefit from them, feel free to just add them, right? So you can edit those pages, you should be able to anyway, and add the content. And if you don't know Markdown yet, well, you will learn it. So it's quite nice. You just copy and paste and see how it works. Use the preview function before you save, by the way. Always good practice. In case you haven't dealt with wikis before. Good. Did I forget anything? No? No one reminds me? Okay. Evidently, I didn't. So, good. So, again, some people may be nervous about their time slots. Just bear in mind, it's just an allocation of your load, right? So, if it's early, guess what? You're looking into it earlier, right? Then there's a bit more of a time frame afterwards. And otherwise, you need to deal with this later to some extent. So, it's a bit fluent there. You just don't see it as pressure, being inherently pressure. And the ones that present early, of course, have the opportunity to talk more broadly about topics, of course, right? Whereas the later groups need to be slightly more responsive to what has been talked about already, right? You don't want to repeat the same theory. You don't want to repeat the same paper and so on, right? So it's give and take in doing it early or late. So it's by no means a deterrent to say, hey, I want to do it as late as possible. Second of all, again, I hope some of you still remember, we expect you to write a report as well on top of this, right? So having the lecture coincide with the report may or may not be optimal at some stage. Cool. Questions about my long monologue? Björn?
Just a quick, we were supposed to create this common or this group or not separate presentation, right?
Yes, that's a group exercise. So it's basically, first of all, we expect to do it for an extended period, right? So we wouldn't expect to, just empathize with me. I'm talking 1.5 hours, right? So don't do that. It's not healthy. But this way, you can first of all organize your chunks accordingly. You can say, hey, I'm talking about a theory, more practical. I'm doing examples and so on. So you have the opportunity to also structure your lecture accordingly. And we don't care how you do if you want to do rotation, if you just do a sequential approach, but you want to kind of integrate this nicely so it becomes harmonic, because it's a bit of an art as well, handing over, right? So it's like playing in a band as well, right? So if you play an instrument and you're playing a solo, then you need to have a really nice finish. You may be a brilliant artist, but you may not be a team player. And that's quite important here as well. So we want to train this as well. So we would not expect anyone individually to talk for an extended period about a topic. That's exhausting, especially if you're not doing this frequently anyway, and a bit too much, I suspect. No, it's a group effort, right? So it's more about coordination than really about exhausting you in any way. And sorry?
And what if the team will be a group of 4 people, not 3?
Guess what?
I don't know, like the 4 people can choose 4 examples and explain them.
I see, right. No, so you basically distribute the lecture amongst 4, that was my intuition. But in terms of the structure, you can do that. Again, if you have a topic, right, that has a bit of a theoretical or research perspective or a practical perspective, education is such an example. Yeah. You want to talk about educational theories that are relevant, other than ones Rune talked about, unless you want to just jumpstart our memory, of course, but perhaps aspects underlying the different theories, for example, then present some examples, and the scientific papers often have an extended evaluation, so they're doing some sort of psychological exercise. Generally, they assess if those games actually work, right? And that's worth another discussion. So in worst case, well, that's perhaps in best case, you can pick perhaps 2 of those papers, right, and actually discuss in greater detail. Again, recall that we also have a specified papers, which is kind of negotiated with Rune or me in advance, which we ask you to disseminate amongst the class using the issue tracker. So everyone has to read this and be prepared to some extent to the discussion. And that's also an opportunity for you to extend the discussion on a particular paper. I think the arrangement should scale well. And of course, we want to respond to this. If your talk is longer or shorter, I mean, it doesn't really matter. The key thing is about getting a message across, right? Right. So I'm trying to keep my talk at 10 minutes every time, but nevertheless, I overshoot and end up, 2 hours.
So 4 people can be one team on one topic.
That's correct. In principle, I don't think that's the problem. You need to organize it well. Point is, it's still, you want to have your best shot at it, right? Especially if you're a large number of people, you want to coordinate well. It just doesn't mean less work, it just conversely means coordination effort, right? Also, you need to still fork out papers out of this, so it's another one. So you still need to look substantively into the area of interest. But fundamentally, I don't see that problem. In fact, it can make for a nice combo, especially in the area of education. Right, so because you have those subfields and they link well, meaning if you talk about the same theory, right, you look something into more general education, and the science people build on the same theory and have something more specific in their branch, I think that could make for a nice integration, especially so it's not like 1 or 2 weeks apart, or in worst case completely disconnected. So no problem, as far as I'm concerned. Again, the talk should be about learning something, right? While you're developing them, you learn something. Try to convey whatever you have learned to the class and introduce it into the discussion, so it's also meaningful. Also, see it as an opportunity to shape your oral exam, because this content may be, of course, accessible. So if you come up with really interesting aspects, we'll feed on those, of course. Other comments, questions? Good. Well, if anything more comes up, and I suspect it will, once, especially after the first student session and so on, or perhaps next week even, we can of course talk about this as well. So yeah, so it's just important that you guys book your or set up your time slots. Please don't overwrite each other. Commit to it. I'll eventually, stabilize this and produce a PDF out of it, so it's clear and unambiguous. And please plan accordingly, right? So master students, independents, and all that kind of stuff. So I expect that people know their schedule and can plan according to it, not being nudged at all times. Good. All right. So, okay. So having talked about the organizational aspects, now I'm switching to a bit more substantive content, which is kind of relevant, especially in the context of serious games. And it feeds well, it continues from our discussion about what? What did we talk about in the last session? Yeah? Okay, we talked about literature review, yeah. And before that, the week before that? The week, it's all important, that's right, but that's more like for doing the report. What did you talk about more?
Different aspects in developing the games.
Yeah. Can you?
The frameworks and stuff.
Yeah, exactly, right? So we talked about the frameworks, right? So what are those frameworks useful for? Anyone? That's an open question, so you got good job throwing in the term frameworks, that's good, yeah.
Yeah, how the different parties of a game deceive or see the game from the developer side, from the player side.
Yeah, exactly, right? So we had this, which framework was particularly focused on that?
Mechanics, dynamics,
Correct.
statics, so
Yep.
MDA.
Cool, sounds good, well done. Nicely derived, but indeed, that's right. So that's the kind of the standard framework. It kind of what should be, you should have that framework handy, perhaps also know shortcomings on. But so it was really more about looking at games from a different perspective, right? Pros, designers, and of course hopefully the users. What did we talk about after that, in that very same session, or some other aspect? Because we dug deeper into selected aspects, specifically one aspect of that framework.
How do we maintain balance?
Ah, right. And which part of the MDA framework does it relate to?
Having the balance between seriousness for game
Yeah.
and too much of gamification. It should not be
I see.
too much of game and very less seriousness. I mean,
Yeah.
tying it to the objectives,
Yeah.
and neither it should be other way around.
Okay. Yep. That's right. So you're saying about the balance of, gamification, literally. So yeah, that's a good point. There was another form of balance. In fact, there was heaps of different types of balance. All about balance in the end. What other forms of balance did we talk about? Since we're on it.
Yeah, that the dynamic, that the mechanic, that's not a purely mechanical game, not a purely aesthetic game,
Nice.
but you need a balance between the
Yeah.
two.
So managing this, right? So and making it useful for the player, and ideally in the context of serious games to have a serious, that means real world outcome associated with this, right? So that's the key understanding there. So this discussion was largely related to designing the game from the bottom up, but probably a bit more with the focus on to some extent the principal mechanics you can employ to design the games. But we still need to populate them, right? So we said, okay, that's balanced. That is, you can use rewards. You can use currency in games and so on. But we didn't really talk about why and when this may be appropriate. And that's pretty much what this session is a bit about, by linking it to different forms of players, perhaps game types and so on. And of course, underlying motivations. So we actually need to think about how we can use those and operationalize those for specific purposes, of course. And they vary, as you will know now, based on topic areas, right? So training has very different objectives than education in the context of cognitive abilities or developing awareness. So it's quite different. All right. And to do that, we need to look into social psychological theories, or to some extent psychological theories as well, as a primer. And this will nicely feed, of course, into the educational aspects. But I think it's important to be aware of some of those psychological models. Did you learn about any psychological or social psychological model in other contexts, be it your high school or other university courses? Or perhaps some of you took a psych class, and if that's the case, then you continue the lecture. No one? No? Okay. Because I don't want to firstly repeat things, but it also gives you an opportunity to jumpstart certain aspects for you. So, well, what determines our behavior is fundamentally the question if we think about psychology in the strong sense and social psychology in the extended sense. So psychology is centered around the individual and your motivations, your feelings, and your drivers for behavior. Whereas social psychology is primarily concerned with social interaction, right? It would be about group settings, two people and so on, right? How they influence each other, how they can stimulate each other. So some of the theories touch upon both. Some of them are really clearly associated with one of those areas. But what is important when we talk about human behavior? Well, we need to identify somewhat. We want to drive behavior in serious games, right? So most likely there is some sort of behavioral change that we want to initiate, ideally, or at least we want to develop some skill set. Part of this effort is, of course, to have a certain motivation to play a game, right? So that's where it becomes interesting. How do we, with such diversity of potential players, how can we ensure that they are all motivated to play the same game? Or is it even possible to get them motivated to play the same game? And what makes you tick is the key question there. Other aspects such as fatigue, for example, how fit you are determines how much attention you can spend, both to the lecture, for example, but also to games, of course. The need for social interactivity. Some of you may be more inclined to play games that have a social component. Some others don't really care about the social bit, just do getting stuff done, and I don't care about anything around this. Emotional aspects are important, of course, both in terms of the situation in which you're playing, but also the emotions that a game can evoke that may relate to your real life in a good or bad sense. And then your interest in novelty, for example, that is hopefully a driver alongside motivations, kind of mirrored quite well as a balance there, that we want to, of course, foster, but not completely extinguish as past if we, for example, make a game too challenging. So humans are not simple. I don't know. I think, at least as far as my communicative abilities go, I would say they're not, because it's really hard to predict many of your behaviors, right? So I consider humans largely non-deterministic, even though some theories will claim otherwise. But just to give you some examples of the challenges that are associated with identifying and getting a better understanding of human behavior, there were two, in fact, series of influential games that were in a social psychological setting, set in the early and mid 20th century, to kind of assess in how far what drives people. So, and one of them was the Hawthorne Experiment, which was set in the 1920s roughly, 1930s, and the Milgram Experiment series. And does that ring a bell to some of you? Milgram, Hawthorne? Sometimes people have heard about it. In any case, you should hear about it. But just informally, I'm not going deep into this. I just want to show you the complexity, but also problems that psychological studies can have more generally, but also how erratic our behavior can be. And one of them is the Hawthorne Experiment. So it was set in the Hawthorne works, which were part of the Western Electric Company in the 1920s, and they produced telephone circuits, cables, telephones, and so on, right? Perhaps you remember those times where all the telephones look the same? I don't know. Hang on. Do you remember the times of where we have telephones? I know you don't have anymore, right? But they all came from a telephone company, and now it would be probably would it be Telenor at that stage already, or were they still called Telewerk? Yeah. So you would have the same stock standard telephone, right? Same ugly color and same dial pad and all that kind of stuff. US would be AT&T probably delivering it, and so on. So that kind of stuff, right? So basically, just imagine if you produce everything in one plant, it's a giant plant. There are 20,000 or more, I think 40,000 people in fact. And the Hawthorne works were one of the main development point in Illinois in the US. And of course, it made it very interesting from an analytical perspective to see how we can improve worker productivity. In the 1920s, there was a general drive towards thinking about industrial workers as sources of productivity, not the machines, but the workers. So it was recognized that human capital is something that exists, even though it was mostly in the form of manual labor. The most important movement into this end was the idea of Taylorism. That is basically doing rigid accounting of your productivity in the workplace. So literally, someone standing next to you with a stopwatch and actually counting how long it takes you to perform a certain task, then going to the next task, seeing how long you take there, and then adding it all up and using this as a baseline metric for productivity. Can we increase it? Can we reduce it? We should do that with you guys, huh? Next to students, master thesis, right? So stopwatch, right? And then you will see how quickly you switch.
Page day keeps the advisor away.
Sorry?
A page day keeps your advisor away.
Oh, right, that's a nice one. So
that's the same thing.
That's a very soft heuristic, though. Come on, I mean, if I'm standing there with a stopwatch, I think Facebook is immediately gone from the desktops, right? So, so I think that's slightly more coercive. Modern Taylorism, isn't it beautiful? Or you need to share the screen forcefully while writing the thesis. Anyway, but think about this as an equivalent, a modern equivalent of what has happened there, right? Literally, you're working on an assembly line or some other capacity doing manual work, and someone is watching at all times and keeping track of you. So it was a big movement, and then they figured out people have feelings as well, so it kind of doesn't work in the long run, so you can't just make things, kind of quantify everything and make things more standardized anyway. And nowadays that's less relevant anyway, since we are relying less on routine work anyway, right? So it was in the early industrialization. So what's the aspect there? The experiments they want to do in this Hawthorne works, because they were so big and therefore considered representative of the American industrial sector, if not even global, they wanted to see under which conditions people work better, right? So they basically had people assembly phones and so on. Then they changed the lighting settings, for example. They introduced random breaks. I think they also provide food at some stage during breaks. They changed the working hours and so on. But the main experiment that is related to it was the change of the lighting. So increasing the lighting or reducing the lighting, would that change productivity of workers? And now your guess.
I think it does.
Okay.
So
Why?
like severely decreasing lighting, it's like really
Sure.
dark. That would of course decrease productivity because it's like a more sleepy environment.
Yeah.
And I think like really bright would also decrease productivity. So you have to find
The middle ground there,
the
right?
middle ground, or I think it's like a higher.
Sweet spot. Yeah.
Higher.
So you're arguing for, within the band of sensible lighting conditions, you would argue for the higher band. Is that the essence, right? So, of course, if you make it dark, guess what? Productivity may just randomly go down. If not, stop. Anyway, but yeah, cool. Any other views? Why are we talking about lighting in serious games? Anyway, good. Well, the point is, it wasn't the lighting. So what happened? Yes, sure, productivity increased. But the productivity increased under both conditions. So both when you increase the lighting or reduce the lighting. Any idea why?
They were monitored.
Exactly, right? So it was actually the fact that people were monitored that made them act differently. And as soon as those researchers went away again, everything was back to normal, right? Productivity was independent, so they were inherently indifferent about lighting conditions, especially if they're static anyway. But it was precisely this, right? Being part of a study, being monitored, being observed was the key difference there. And if you think about this from an experimental point of view, what does it tell you?
Well, it's difficult to really conduct an experiment and have it apply in the real world.
That's one of the lessons, right? There's always a disconnect between the lab, if you like, and the real work environment, and they want to get as close as possible by doing it in the factory already. So that's a good point. So you can't necessarily rely on experimental results, and especially if the condition is artificial, and more so, you may what you said.
Yeah, if you want like a precise or more effective outcome, the test subjects need to be unaware that they are monitored.
Exactly, right? So that's the unawareness aspect. Again, that brings a lot of ethical implication because we're not allowed to do this often, right? So deceit is not something we are supposed to employ anymore. That's the nice part. In the 1920s and the 1950s that you will see, it didn't matter, right? You could have them slaughter each other because they signed away their life anyway when entering the experiment because they got $4 an hour. Brilliant, huh? Come on, but, in 1950s. So that's a lot of money. Right. So cool. So the Hawthorne Spirit, meaning it's really hard to assess human behavior, especially in an experimental setting, and relying on it. Right. So claiming validity is a big one. If you read a paper, we have shown that. Right. So you really want to step back and look at this paper from bird's eye perspective, and ask, are you really sure you have shown that? First of all, generally. And does it even apply for your instance, for example? And is it really the intervention you did that changed to something, or is it just the fact that you did the experiment, right? So this has taught a lot of lessons in terms of experimental design. And the second one talks about ethical boundaries, Milgram experiments. Did I jumpstart anyone with the previous experiments with respect to Milgram at this stage? No, still not. Classical social psychology experiments. You kind of want to know about this because they are that's the kind of experiments you can't do anymore. So it's really nice anecdotal. You have nice anecdotal value sometimes. So the idea there was to test authority, the role of authority in social interaction, but also, for example, in work relationships and so on. So what did they do? Probably should have put a figure in here, but what they effectively did was they chose a uniform group of, not really uniform, a controlled group of participants, generally male, of wide range of education, so it could be really uneducated or college educated, and they put them in a room setting along with a scientist, white coat, that kind of setting, 1950s, imagine a bit more traditional, like looking probably not as...
Is this the prison experiment, or...?
No, not that one.
Okay.
That was what's his name? Zimbardo, right? So it's a different experiment, but it has similar problem. You can't do it again. So I could have equally used this one. You can elaborate on this experiment in a second. That's a good point. So Milgram was basically about you are put in a situation, right? So imagine Runa wearing a white, scientist kind of outfit and so on, right? So telling me, okay, what I'm supposed to do. And the question was basically, or the exercise was there to expose people to electric shocks, right? So the person sitting in another room, you wouldn't see him, but the idea you would have a control panel and you would administer electric shocks. You could choose to some extent the variation of the shocks, low, mild, extensive. And what you get here as feedback would be the shouting of the person from the other room, right? So you can imagine it's a really eerie setting, doomy setting if you like. And the instruction was as follows, that basically the scientists increasingly pushed the participants to increase the voltage, right? Because the shouting comes louder and louder and louder. And what they wanted to test basically, and they did so successfully, how important, how easily people are controlled by authority, especially if you have certain signals or symbols that signify authority, white coat, right? Things like this, or researcher or whatever else. So, basically the outcome is there that irrespective of education level, people are quite susceptible to authority relationships, status difference. Right. So basically you would listen and basically do what the person says. Only very few actually resisted to increase the power further because the screaming become unsensible. And another note, the voltages they applied would have been more than enough to kill any of those people. Of course, they didn't apply it to people, so it was just a staged situation. But the point is, even if you had the background in realizing, what the human body can endure, that would have gone well exceeded any of such limits. So it would have been a fatal exercise. So here's really about obedience, right? So we can be, and we probably are to some extent. We may not want to admit this, we may not want to see it, obedient, in specific settings, right? But again, awareness about those things helps you a bit, right? If you put in a similar setting, it could hopefully lead to a different outcome. Now Zimbardo, what was that about? Do you remember?
I don't remember the whole thing, but it was essentially just that they put two groups of people, where one was officers and the other were prisoners.
Yeah.
And to just simulate the prison environment, and then turned into a real prison.
Yes.
Because the officers went bad with power.
Yeah. Exactly. So it was literally this. So they basically told you, they put you in a room, right? They split you in the middle, say, you're the prison guards, you're prisoners. And then they let you, with food and all that kind of stuff, let you in a prepared prison environment, and then the guards need to watch the prisoners. Turns out it was really more ugly than a real prison, because the guards felt the need of power and the sudden surge of power, and there was no ethical boundaries. They didn't have any training. What are the ethical limitations of torture, for example, right? How can you speak to people? How can you what is allowed, legally allowed, because they just went rogue, pretty literally. And they had to shut down this experiment because there were people breaking down. I don't think anyone died in this process, but I think there were severe psychological damages incurred as part of it. Also an experiment we can't repeat, so to say. But we have a nice basement, though. We could have the second. Anyway, but that's probably not enough. So they call it the Jörvik follow-up study. No, let's not push this. But so Zimbardo's experiment was also one of those. What is it, 60s, I believe, right? 50s, 60s, somewhere there. Those evil times, medieval times.
60s university students, I think.
Sorry?
I think it was 60s university students.
Right. Exactly, and with university students, that's the best part of it. They ran it at Stanford, right? Stanford Prison Experiment, I think, is the tag. You're right, that was the worst bit. So even that, it doesn't guard you guys, right? You can claim all the degrees you want. You're probably equally susceptible to this pressure. Anyway, I don't want to push it too far, but you get the gist here. So human behavior is diverse. Human behavior, to some extent, has risks, so we need to control them. And that's important for you as well, right? So you don't want to go down the wrong pathway. If you teach unethical behavior, guess what? You may potentially succeed if you get the wrong kind of people, right? Awareness can be good, but overdoing awareness can also be risky because then you challenge any of your decisions you're making, any of your moves you're making, become very inefficient in being in the real world. So, anyway, that's just a kind of motivational backdrop. So when we talk about games, that's what I actually want to get at. It's not about just understanding the psyche of human beings, but linking it back to serious games is important to see which fundamental theory does your game or whatever you intend to do underlie. Because there are various different ones. They are determined in different environmental settings. There are some of them more theoretical, more abstract. Some of them are very concrete, and some are basically empirically grounded, basically derived from experiments. And we look at two groups of theories and then certain examples of those ones. And that's on the one hand, motivational theories. They're really about getting you to do something, right? So if you have a particular objective you want to achieve, learning something, become better at maths, those theories were really about figuring out how we can make you do this. This one. And then there's a second group of theories which sits in the process-centric perspective. And they focus on behavior change more general. So what are the factors that drive behavior change? Both rather simple models and much more complicated models. So it's not so much about a concrete objective necessarily, in as much as it is about identifying how we can trigger behavioral change. And one of the most important theories in there, and I think that's underlying most serious games, I believe, there's no solid assessment of that at all, so it's a bit of a wild, educated guess, I would say. But the perception is that self-determination theory is really strongly embedded. So what's that thing about? It's actually quite recent. It's from 1985, roughly, and the idea is there. You guys are aware of human needs, right? So those theories have been around since the 1950s. What's the most popular example of human needs, basic human needs theory? You had this in high school. I know it. It's part of the curriculum. Yeah,
Pavlov's?
Yeah, nearly. Pavlov's good as well. It's a different kind of experiment. Pavlov's dog, yeah, but no. What's the guy?
The pyramid.
Yeah.
That's pyramid. Pyramid is a good way out. That's perfect, right?
Hierarchy of needs.
Pyramid is always
What's
good.
his name?
That's
Maslow?
right. Correct,
There we
right?
go.
So it doesn't matter anyway. But the point is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's the key. And pyramid is the key point there, right? So it's really about identifying this. And what was it about? Just roughly. Don't.
The underlying needs to be fulfilled before the other ones.
Exactly. So it's basically, I think I even shot of this one, just to bring it back up, so you kind of are back on top. So basically the idea is that you have several layers of needs that humans have, and you assume those to be general. And they would start with physiological ones, very clear. So for example, you need to have the access to food, you must be able to breathe, and water, of course, sexual activity, sleep, and be able to go to the toilet as well. So those are basically basic needs that humans need to satisfy before they move one level up and get some sort of dignity, in the sense that they actually care about their own security, they care about employment, for example, as a way of earning money independently. Going from there, we enter the need of belonging. So once people have satisfy their basic security environment, like having shelter and things like this, they can actually engage with others, actually deal with others more efficiently. And then increasingly from there, people actually get more motivated and perhaps more driven to seek and satisfy their personal goals, for example, develop confidence, self-esteem, and fundamentally become creative as a base of this. So that was the assumption that you need to satisfy those layers in order to arrive at this peak level, which of course is something you kind of want to push people to, especially in context of behavior change and so on, because you need to motivate them to do it. Problem there, or fundamental assumption, is that you need to satisfy them in iterative order. And this is the main criticism. I think this thing is from 1950s, did I get it right? I may have forgotten this, I think 54 or something. But the problem with this is the assumption about the order. Turns well out. Quite a nice, interesting set of studies. So African nations, this is inverted. Safety comes before physiological needs, for example, or sociality comes before safety needs, for example. Some people find safety by sociality, for example. So the idea is that, it could have held, first of all, by the crude observation that Maslow did himself, but it's certainly not cross-culturally applicable, and it doesn't take situation into account. There are certain situations in which belonging is simply more important, other than safety. In another situation, those may be more important. So talking about safety, so your safety needs seem to be inherently low, having taken the risk sitting on that chair. All right, so we take a break for like until 8 minutes past 1.